Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Lord. I'm an art historian, and welcome to this Q&A session. I live in Cwm Rheidol, which is 9 miles from the centre of Aberystwyth, but I'm afraid as far as BT Openreach is concerned, that's some considerable distance the wrong side of the Styx, out in the Ceredigion underworld. There's no internet here. The satellite which we use here is not fast enough to sustain a live meeting on Zoom, I'm afraid. So I can't interact directly with you, which is a great pity, because obviously that's really the essence of a Q&A. And I must apologize, therefore, if my response to your questions, thank you very much for sending them in, is a little bit more formal than it otherwise would be. I've made, in fact, some notes which I'll be referring to here, but I'll do my best to be as spontaneous as I can. It's a bit difficult when I'm just looking at an image of myself on the screen here. Now, as you know, I'm an art historian. So it was curious, really, that almost all of the questions you sent to me were about contemporary art in Wales and the art world in Wales as it is now. Although that was where my writing started 35 years ago, I've written less and less on that subject as time has gone by. What I was expecting was a series of questions arising from the book that I published with Parthian at the end of last year, Looking Out. Here it is, subtitled Welsh Painting, Social Class and International Context. And I was expecting that the questions would focus on the 6 chapters in that book and some of the issues which I raised there, because the main reason for putting the book together was to go more deeply and therefore more contentiously, probably, into some of those issues which had to be skated over in previous publications, and especially in my book, The Tradition, which was published, I think, in 2016. The Tradition is a survey work, which is fine as far as it goes. But I've always felt that if we want our visual culture to be taken seriously, if indeed we're taking it seriously ourselves, never mind what people outside perceive, we've got to do much more than simply get a body of work visible out there and a single narrative which in some way ties it all together. We've got to go much more deeply into those works and into the context in which they were created and present the many issues that arise there so that they become part of the natural intellectual discourse of the nation. They've got to embed themselves in our minds so that we can draw on them in discussions about much wider issues, just in the same way as we would draw on literature to enlighten us, to direct our discussions about contemporary issues. And I don't think we're anywhere near there yet with visual images, but that was very much one of the things that I wanted to move along in this new book. Now, linking the past to the present, as an historian, I've noted over the years that many of the best quotations that I use to deploy now about the art of the past have come from artists and critics who've been trying to comment on the art of their own times and getting things wrong, usually. Now, I don't mean the kind of connoisseurial judgments that get made about whether this artist is better than that artist and those kinds of things. Those sort of judgments are inevitably vulnerable to fleeting changes of fashion and taste. But I mean rather the larger statements that one finds where a critic attempts to sum up the state of the world or assess the artistic zeitgeist of the period, or to nail the big issues which seem to them to really matter. They're almost always wildly wrong. I understand why, of course. It's that old problem of trying to paint an extensive landscape from the middle of a dense forest. I do personally draw a lesson from that, which is that perhaps it's best not to try. One of the few quotes from the 19th century that I know of, which really does ring true still, is about the painter and polemicist Hugh Hughes. He was born in 1790 and died in 1863. I've written a lot about Hughes, as some of you know, I'm sure. Summing up a life in which he was often in heated, angry indeed, dispute with his contemporaries, someone who knew Hugh Hughes once said that in many ways he was not really of his own time. And as a result, he was misunderstood by his contemporaries. And furthermore, that he did not himself truly understand the times in which he lived. In the past, when I wrote about contemporary issues in documents like Cultural Policy or The Aesthetics of Relevance, I probably did think that I had some understanding about my contemporary world. But the more one learns about the past, the less confident one becomes in pontificating about the present, and certainly about the future. Many of the opinions I expressed back then haven't changed. But of course, the world very much has changed. And so I often feel these days that, rather like Hugh Hughes, I'm no longer living in my own time. So as a person born in the 1940s, I think the wisest course for me is not to pontificate too often on the subject of the state of the arts at present, and especially on paper and in recordings like this. The expression of my opinions about art today is probably best confined to the hearing of consenting adults in private. But what I can do with some of your questions about the here and the now is to answer in a more personal way in terms of my own experience moving on the fringes of the art world over the last 50 years, or perhaps more broadly, to relate contemporary questions to some historical examples, and that's what I'm going to try and do. I think that one of the reasons that some of you have asked about my attitude to contemporary art is because at the start of my career, I was a practitioner. Sarah Roslin refers to that in her question, and in particular to the work that I designed at Glynllifon near Carnarvon, which was called Guerilla and Grife. That work lasted only 6 months before it was systematically destroyed by a group of people who presumably took exception to its narrative. Based on that distressing experience and on my subsequent work in art history, Sarah's interested to know what I might now make if I was given the opportunity. Well, the first thing to say is that the destruction of that work, which I felt was the best thing that I'd ever done at the time, the destruction of that work was very painful, both for the obvious reason that I'd put years of work into it and that I believed in it. But more importantly, perhaps in retrospect, because I realize now that I'd allowed myself to think that it was a work made on behalf of a community that I thought had been profoundly wronged. I saw its destruction, in fact, I suppose, as an act of self-harm. Well, I got part of that correct, but I was seriously misguided when I thought that I had the right to speak on someone else's behalf about the wrong that had been done, that my perception of the nature of that wrong would be the same as that of the people who'd suffered the consequences of it generations later. Clearly not. The narrative spoke to an issue that was long past as far as the contemporary world of those who rejected the work was concerned. And I think I can say that because the destruction of the work was so thorough that it's unlikely to have been an act of casual vandalism. It was clearly premeditated. But whatever motivated its destruction, the action convinced me that I would not again make a public artwork. It was, in fact, the end of my professional career as an artist. In my new book, I've looked at another example of large-scale public art, and I've asked questions about it, which I'm sure must, in part, have been conditioned by my own experience with guerilla and grife. The work is M.E. Eldridge's mural sequence, The Dance of Life. I've written about several aspects of the mural, and I think it's perhaps the most potentially controversial essay in the book. And I'm a little surprised that no one has yet anyway, challenged me about it. One of the questions I've raised concerns the mural's lack of narrative coherence, or what I perceive to be the mural's lack of narrative coherence. Clearly, its title and its huge scale signify an attempt to make a grand philosophical statement about the condition of the world, based, as it happens, largely on Christian iconography. What I've argued is that in making a public art work, there's an ethical responsibility always on the artist to make his or her narrative clear, coherent. And I feel that Eldridge's mural does not do that, but tends towards a rather self-indulgent reissuing of a variety of visual tropes, which have their origins, in fact, in the 1930s. And I suggested that it's only through looking at the influence of that period on the artist that we can understand what's going on in a work made in the post-war period, which she finished, in fact, in 1956. In particular, I've argued that by contextualizing the work in terms of Eldridge's illustrations for Henry Williamson's book, The Starborn, first published in 1933, we can make some sense of the mural painting. Now, Williamson was a fascist. He was a black shirt. He traveled to the 8th Nazi Party Congress and rally at Nuremberg in 1936, and he was profoundly moved and excited by what he saw there. He had some kind of apotheosis there. And he remained faithful to Hitler and to Oswald Mosley, not only throughout the war, but afterwards as well, and into the period in which he and Eldridge were in communication about the illustrations for a new addition to The Starborn. So Eldridge's mural was presented to the world, like her illustrations to The Starborn, out of their time. And to answer Sarah's question, I suppose I feel that anything I might do now as an artist would suffer from the same consequent shortcomings. On the other hand, as a writer, I can try to present the past to the present in ways that I think make it usable. And in my use of that word, I'm referring to the ideas of the American cultural critic Van Wyck Brooks, who talked about the creation of tradition by discovering a usable past in the United States of America. He was talking about that well before the Great War. By usable, I mean presenting for you ideas which you can deploy, those of you who are much more in sync perhaps with the world as it is now than I am, presenting things to you which you can deploy to develop your own ideas in the things which you make, which will shape our future. Now, my writing about Emmy Eldridge leads me to the question asked by Catherine Tan about what she describes as the gender landscape of art in Wales. When I first wrote about Eldridge in 1998, I had a feminist agenda firmly in mind. The essay I wrote arose because John Barney, the editor of Planet, had become interested in the relationship between R.S. Thomas and Eldridge, husband and wife, of course, and the imbalance between the reputations of the two. John and I went over to Gorbowen to see the Dance of Life mural, and we were duly impressed, but depressed also by its poor condition, which suggested, to me at any rate, that those who lived and worked in its presence perhaps felt it was somewhat irrelevant. I'd like to go back a stage to enlarge on this and say that feminist theory had been a part of my intellectual and personal life from the start of the 1970s. My partner from 1972 was a member of one of the first women's groups to be established in England, which was where we lived at the time. And of course, it was also in that year that Spare Rib magazine was founded, and my partner took it, and we both read it from the very beginning. I was particularly interested in parallels between feminist theory as it evolved in art history just at the same time. Linda Naucklin's seminal essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, was published just the year before. I think it was 1971. When I came to Wales 3 years later and started to think seriously about colonialism, which was the issue that confronted me immediately as an incomer, when I started to think about that, I was very struck by the fact that feminist critique and nationalist critique were asking parallel questions and seemed to me to be moving in parallel. It's probably relevant also that most, not all, but most of the professional relationships that I've had in the course of my work have been with women. So When I went to university in Reading in 1966, for instance, my tutor was Rita Donner, who was a very well-known figure in the trendy London art world of the period. The teacher with whom I had the closest relationship was the sculptor Carol Hodgson, happily still at work. And my art history tutor was Caroline Tisdale, soon to become the art critic of The Guardian. Tisdale, by the way, was the curator of the art exhibition at the National Eisteddfod at Wrexham in 1977, which provoked Paul Davis's protest and resulted in the iconic image of Paul holding up a Welsh knot above his head, a huge Welsh knot. And when I started to exhibit my work in London, the two galleries that took my work were both founded and run by women, Angela Flowers and Annalie Judah. And then when I came to Wales, I was given my first one-person exhibition at Oriel in Cardiff by Isabel Hitchman. After that, Tamara Krikorian was very closely involved with developing my work at Glyn Llifon, guerilla grife, which I talked about. So my personal experience of what Catherine asks about the gender landscape in the art world has been heavily weighted on the side of women. But of course, I will not be tempted to overgeneralize from my own experience. That's just my personal, very fortunate and very productive experience. But the point is that when I came to write about Emmy Eldridge, I was primed to feel that her work and reputation had been submerged under that of her husband as a result of attitudes to gender. And that suspicion was reinforced. It seems absurd now, actually, to think about it, but that suspicion was reinforced when R.S. Thomas declined my request to talk to him about Eldridge's painting. He wrote a note to me to say that, and I quote, Emmy Eldridge did not discuss her work with me, which seemed pretty unlikely, especially if we remember that not all that long before he'd published a book of poems about paintings. Anyway, I concluded that he did not wish me to celebrate the achievements of Eldridge for fear that they might be construed as diminishing his own. And it was in that state of mind that I wrote the Planet essay. Well, then a couple of years ago, which is to say a quarter of a century later, the opportunity arose to talk and write about Eldridge once again. I was keen to do that because attitudes to women practitioners had changed so much in the meantime as a result of the influence of feminist critique and the recovery of many marginalized women practitioners. However, in that new context, it seemed to me, and it seems to me, that a tendency had emerged to almost to canonize Eldridge in a gender-inflected response to the mythologized status of her husband. It was as if she'd almost become Saint Elsie, martyred on the misogyny of her husband in the art world. But I felt that to laud her work now purely in reaction to the critical indifference shown to it between the mid-1950s and the 1990s was simply to invert the gender prejudice of those 40 years. And so, in fact, to continue to fail to accord to her work the equality of respect that the sincerity of its production certainly deserved. And that's why the two essays read very differently. In the new essay, I tried to go beyond a response to the particular gender issues of today to look at the mural as the product of a person exposed to all sorts of powerful social and political forces that affected everyone in the 1930s. Eldridge's responses in that period were, of course, affected by the gender issues of her own time. One only has to note the prominence of women in her imagery and the very strange and fantastical way that she presented women to see that. So one of the things I've looked at in the essay is the work of German painters in the period, who were, of course, presenting a highly differentiated concept of gender roles in Heimat painting. And I think it's in that context that a thorough feminist critique of the work of Emmy Eldridge would be most interesting. And it certainly remains to be done. I've only hinted at the need for it in my essay, and I hope it will be done. But I do think it's important that when that critical assessment is undertaken, it's done in a way which is mindful of the gender issues as they appear to her at the time, not so much in terms of our retrospective, projecting back the gender issues of today onto that other period. Now, I mentioned fantasy in the work of Eldridge, which I suppose is at the root of my difficulty with her work. I don't like fantasy I can't get on with fantasy in visual art or in literature, in fact. And so that's an appropriate point to turn to a question from Alice von Rothkirch, who points out, and I quote Alice here, that while a lot of 20th century painting has eschewed realism as outdated and ineffective in describing modern reality, the pendulum has been swinging the other way recently. Realism, Alice says, is back. Well, of course, in Wales, it was the dominance of the 56 group, founded obviously in 1956, but importantly in the year in which Eldridge finished painting The Dance of Life. The 56 group, promoted relentlessly by the Arts Council for decades afterwards, it was their emergence that was responsible for the marginalization of figurative painting like that practiced by Eldridge. I take Alice's use of the word realism in its broadest sense here, first of all, to mean simply the representation of the observed world as the visual language through which to convey whatever it is the artist has to say. Now, Alice also mentions in this context the question of academic art training, which is very interesting. Again, perhaps my personal experience of that may be of some relevance here. The 56 group developed largely within the context of the expansion of the art colleges in the late 50s and through the 1960s. Most of the members were art college teachers. And most of them were also heavily influenced and invested in the philosophy of what was called basic design as a teaching process. Tom Hudson introduced it in Cardiff in the mid-60s, for instance, just as I experienced it from 1966 in the Fine Art Department at Reading University. Now, what it meant was that one was denied any training which carried the resonance of the academic system which had preceded it. And in particular, it meant that one was not taught to draw. At Reading, we had a very nice life studio. In fact, I remember it from the very few occasions on which I saw it, because it had those wonderful Assyrian relief carvings, had a cast of those Assyrian reliefs around the walls. Very beautiful. But the room was kept permanently locked because it was believed that learning to draw was damaging to creativity. Life drawing simply was not allowed. It was banned, in fact. Now, personally, that policy would have very serious implications for me, and I know it had for other people who went through the same experience at that time, because I can't draw the human figure from imagination. And when I was practicing as an artist, that was a huge disadvantage to me, because the kind of imagery that I wanted to make did require that I had that skill. It's a skill, of course, which artists trained in the academic tradition in the 19th, 18th, 19th, and first part of the 20th century all have that ability to recreate from imagination, from memory, the human figure in their work. I can produce a reasonable life drawing if the model is in front of me, but not by recall, not from imagination. Now, Alice remarks that the pendulum has now swung back the other way. And if it has, I'm very glad to hear that, because that particular failure of my training is one of the main reasons why I personally ceased to be a practitioner. In another question, Darrell Leaworthy also referred to the figurative tradition, which of course didn't go away in 1956. It was marginalized. We've discussed Eldridge, and Darrell mentions Zaboli and Kevin Sinnott, though his observation is that perhaps at the return of their kind of painting to fashion, it has become what he calls cuffinized, which is a very nice word. I wish I'd thought of that, Darryl. By which he means that the work, and again I'm quoting him, does not speak with an accent that can hold the attention of contemporary Wales. Darryl suggests that, very kindly, suggests that I've been a champion for the everyday qualities of art, and I hope that's true. I hope I've been able to show that at some times and in some places in the past, everydayness and art were not contradictory. But we must be careful here because artists and critics must not be sniffy about cuffing if what they want is everydayness. For lots of people, that's exactly what cuffing is. An artist whose work fits readily into the everyday pattern of life and thought as a part of the material world which anchors them. His work is an expression of many people's sense of self. But of course, to some people who look in from the outside, and perhaps rather from on high, that mindset seems to define them in a negative way. The point is that that discussion is riddled with contradictions and paradox. In looking out, my introduction is very consistent with the celebration of the everydayness that art has been able to achieve at some times in the past and in some places. Although the introduction actually concerns primarily not visual art in that case, but the writing of Arnold Bennett, which I very much admire. Then in my first two proper chapters in the book, I talk about the work of our artisan painters. And in those chapters, I describe how deeply embedded those painters were in the everyday life of what I call the great mass of the middle, the new middle class that emerged in Wales at the start of the 19th century. To get back to Alice's question, my last chapter is indeed about the idea of realism and the representation of reality. And I point out that those two things are quite different. I'm particularly interested here in the age following the decline of artisan portraiture and that everydayness, which Darryl mentions, in the work of artists who observed what they regarded as ordinary life in Wales. Painters ranging from David Cox through the documentary filmmakers and photographers of the 20s and 30s, down to the work, for instance, of Joseph Herman after the Second World War. And I compare that kind of work with the observation of social insiders like Evan Walters, and with the way in which painters working on the European continent, and especially Eugene Laarmans in Belgium, dealt with the reality of class conflict. On the question of realism and the artist representing other people's reality, we have again to be very careful, as I found out with Guerilla Grife. In contrast to the reactionary work of Eldridge, and I use the word reactionary there in a neutral sense to simply describe her state of mind, in contrast to that reactionary state of mind, among left-wing artists and writers, the representation of ordinary life became highly fashionable during the Depression of the 1930s. But when thinking about the work that resulted, I've always been mindful of a statement which opens that remarkable book, Grey Children, a study in humbug and misery in South Wales, a book written by James Hanley, which was published in 1937. Hanley quoted right at the start of the book an unemployed miner who said this: "We're about fed up with people coming down here, looking us over as though we were animals in a zoo." The post-war work of Joseph Herman is very relevant here. As a painter who came into Wales and was immediately lauded for his engagement with the realities of the lives of people perceived by the intelligentsia as ordinary in the democratizing climate of that period. Herman's engagement with the community at Ystrad Gynllais continues to be celebrated, though the evidence of Herman himself suggests that perceptions are more myth than reality. Quite early on, in fact, John Berger picked up on an aspect of this problem and the very fine distinctions which notions of realism and reality demand. In 1952, in the polemical exhibition Looking Forward, which Bergic curated, he promoted artists who were more concerned with the subject of reality than with the reality of their subjective feelings about it. He included Herman in the show, but elsewhere expressed his doubts about the painter's ideological conformity. Now, albeit in long retrospect, Herman himself was very honest about this. In a revealing interview looking back over his life, he remarked of the use he had made of the ordinariness of life in Ystradgynlais. So, for instance, he said, and I quote again, "Whether there was a strike or not, it didn't worry me. I couldn't be less interested. It wasn't in the line of my interest." His interest in the culture, the ordinariness of the community, extended only so far as it represented something he perceived to be deeper and more important. The particular was a vehicle for the general. He was, in fact, mythologizing ordinary lives. As he said himself, the minor has thus become, for me, both incidental and symbolical. Incidental. So here we have another aspect of the paradox that afflicts the representation in art of what we think of as reality. Well, to break my own rule about pontificating on art now, I do suspect that it's perhaps impossible within the framework of the professional art world to regain the everydayness in which art sits functionally within the lives of the broad mass of society. And that's because I don't think that most of us have a use for art, art with a capital A, anymore. It's ceased to be functional in any of the forms which we include within the mainstream tradition. And if it's not functional, it can't have everydayness in a world in which everything is imaged. And the only thing that seems to define art within that barrage of visual information is whether or not the maker of a particular example went to art college. But just as many problems arise, of course, if we change the parameters and expand our definition of art, of the art thing, beyond the mainstream forms that manifest themselves in galleries. It's difficult, whichever way you look at it. Because perhaps if everything is art, then nothing is art, which, by the way, comes close to a typical expression of anti-democratic sentiment written by M.E. Eldridge, reflecting on the democratization of the 1950s. This is what she said. People became all important. Everyone painted. Everyone wrote poetry. Everyone produced a book to express their important selves. Scarcely a good painting, poem, or other to be seen. People expressing their mostly unpleasant selves. So, for Eldridge, good art and art as an ordinary phenomenon were incompatible. I said at the start that I don't really understand the world of now. Perhaps that was an overstatement. And what I really meant was that although I do have at least a vague sense of the direction of travel, I don't much like it. Thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd am wrando.